It's curious because you've sat here all day, and thank you so much for showing up, because this was something that you wanted to do. The Republicans wanted to make sure that you were hid in a room with no cameras, because I was there. They didn't really want you out public because they were afraid of what you would say, which is that you could have proven your case because you are a career prosecutor who knows how to prosecute criminals. So just to be clear, today, it seems like the Republicans have not really fought very much about whether or not Trump was guilty or not. In fact, their fight seems to be over whether or not you were authorized to prove their guilt. Do you recall a number of Republican members asking about whether or not your appointment was okay, even though we know that you've testified about the more than 100-year precedent that allowed for your appointment?
I was asked questions about that today, and our position, as we filed in our appeal, is that there was strong support for my appointment, including Supreme Court precedent directly on point.
Thank you so much. Additionally, everybody's been all gingerly here today, but I don't know why we're acting surprised that a man who had close to 90 allegations out of 4 different jurisdictions and ultimately ended up with 34 convictions after a jury was able to hear all the evidence would possibly be committing a criminal act on January 6th. In fact, considering the fact that we are now under the impression that he is violating people's due process rights, he is ignoring court orders, he's starting wars without congressional authority in contradiction to the Constitution. He's enriching himself to the tune of over $1.4 billion. He's shaking down electeds to draw maps that will help him stay in power because the Republicans don't understand that they swore an oath to the Constitution and that we are supposed to do checks and balances. He's also shaking down TV stations to get money. So why are we trying to pretend as if it is out of the realm for this particular man to commit the crime that he committed on January 6th, and frankly, the only reason he ran for president was to make sure that he would not be prosecuted, because I fully believe that you would have put him under the jail based on our long-form conversation that we had. But according to your special counsel report on page 137, it states the department's view that the Constitution prohibits the continued indictment and prosecution of a president is categorical and does not turn on the gravity of the crimes charged, the strength of the government's proof, or the merits of the prosecution, and that, quote, but for Mr. Trump's election and imminent return to the presidency, the office assessed that the admissible evidence was sufficient to obtain and sustain a conviction at trial. In other words, Donald Trump ran for president, like I said, so he wouldn't have to spend the rest of his life in prison. The chairman and other members of this committee have spent all day attacking you and trying to rewrite the history of January 6th. But Mr. Jim Jordan, the chairman, failed to mention how he was running around the Capitol terrified by the possibility that all those insurrectionists would harm him. In fact, on page 97 of the deposition transcript, you mentioned how Mark Meadows, the president's chief of staff, quote unquote, never saw Jim Jordan so scared. The chairman also failed to mention that he was in direct contact with the White House in the days leading up to and on January 6th, which is why his toll records were subpoenaed by your office. Let me be clear, because they're trying to act like this is Democrats on Republicans, and I guess you are a covert Democrat that knew that he was going to try to steal an election before he tried to steal that election, and so therefore you were somehow put into place. I mean, the conspiracy theories make your head spin, but nevertheless, were you going to subpoena the toll records of every single Republican simply because they were a Republican?
No. We subpoenaed the toll records in the course of this investigation because they were relevant to our investigation.
Relevant. Oh, okay. All right. So that means something about facts. So let's talk about facts. Donald Trump lost to Joe Biden, yes or no?
That's correct.
Okay. In fact, 60 federal and state courts have found that there was no evidence of election fraud. Trump's own attorney general and vice president knew that he lost the election, but he still tried to steal the election by pressuring state officials, designing fake elector plans, nearly having Mike Pence hanged, and ultimately demanding that his supporters, quote, fight like hell, correct?
Correct.
We all saw it happen once they reached We all saw what happened once they reached the U.S. Capitol. As your report outlines, President Trump knew that he would incite violence at the Capitol that day. In fact, some of Trump's senior advisors were pushing for violence. For example, page 81 of the report details how co-conspirators number 2, John Eastman, tried to convince Mike Pence to break the law, stating that, quote, violence was necessary. So it isn't just Trump who is responsible for the death of multiple law enforcement officers and the injuries of thousands of people. A lot of Republican members of Congress are also responsible. 147 Republicans voted to overturn the 2020 election results, including multiple members currently serving on this committee.
This hearing was supposed to be about special counsel investigations. But Representative Jasmine Crockett turned it into something much larger. A direct argument that the real debate surrounding January 6th is no longer about what happened, but whether political power can override accountability after the fact. From the beginning, Crockett framed the hearing as politically controlled theater. She accused Republicans of wanting Special Counsel Jack Smith questioned privately and without cameras because, in her view, they were less interested in disproving the January 6th case than attacking whether Smith was legally authorized to bring it. That distinction mattered. Crockett's central argument throughout the exchange was that Republicans had shifted away from defending Trump's conduct itself and instead focused on procedural attacks against investigators, prosecutors, and institutions involved in the investigations. Smith responded cautiously and institutionally, noting that his office believed there was strong legal precedent supporting his appointment as special counsel. But Crockett immediately escalated the discussion beyond legal procedure. She referenced the multiple criminal cases previously brought against President Donald Trump, including the New York criminal conviction involving 34 felony counts. It is important to distinguish here between allegations, charges, convictions, and political opinion. Crockett blended all four together rhetorically in order to argue that January 6th should not be viewed as an isolated controversy, but as part of a broader pattern of alleged conduct surrounding Trump's presidency and post-election actions. That framing is politically powerful because it shifts the debate away from any single legal dispute and toward a larger narrative about character, institutional norms, and presidential accountability. The hearing then turned toward one of the most consequential constitutional questions surrounding the Trump investigations: whether a sitting or returning president can effectively avoid prosecution through election victory itself. Crockett quoted directly from the Special Counsel report, which stated that the Department of Justice's long-standing position prohibits prosecution of a sitting president regardless of the strength of the evidence or seriousness of the allegations. That issue lies at the center of an ongoing constitutional debate with enormous implications. Critics argue this doctrine risks creating temporary immunity for presidents during periods when they still wield political power. Supporters argue prosecuting a sitting president could destabilize constitutional governance and executive branch independence. Crockett's interpretation was blunt. Trump ran for president again partly to avoid criminal prosecution. That was presented as political opinion and inference rather than a proven factual conclusion. But it reflected a broader argument increasingly made by Trump critics after the 2024 election cycle. The exchange also exposed something deeper about the politics of January 6th. Crockett accused Republicans of attempting to rewrite the history of the Capitol attack while simultaneously reminding viewers that many lawmakers themselves feared for their safety during the riot. She specifically referenced testimony regarding Representative Jim Jordan and communications between members of Congress and the White House before and during January 6th. This section of the hearing reflected one of the biggest unresolved political battles in modern America: how January 6th itself should be remembered. For critics of Trump, January 6th represents an unprecedented attempt to overturn a democratic election, pressure campaigns against state officials, fake elector efforts, and violence directed at constitutional institutions. For many Trump supporters, the investigations themselves are viewed as politically motivated overreach targeting a former president and his allies. That divide remains one of the most polarizing fractures in American political life. What made Crockett's questioning especially striking was how openly she fused legal argument with moral accusation. She repeatedly emphasized that courts rejected widespread election fraud claims, Trump's own administration officials acknowledged Biden's victory, and the violence at the Capitol followed Trump's rhetoric surrounding the election. Smith answered carefully, usually limiting himself to factual confirmations tied directly to investigative findings. That contrast mattered. Crockett spoke like a political advocate trying to define historical memory. Smith spoke like a prosecutor trying to stay within evidentiary boundaries. And that difference reveals something important about modern congressional hearings. They increasingly function simultaneously as oversight proceedings, political messaging events, constitutional debates, and historical framing battles. One of the most consequential portions of the exchange involved the broader role of Congress itself. Crockett argued that lawmakers who voted against certification of the 2020 election results helped legitimize efforts to overturn the election. That accusation goes beyond criticism of Trump personally. It implicates institutional actors across government. And that is why debates surrounding January 6 remain so politically explosive even years later. Because the argument is no longer just about one day. It is about presidential power, constitutional limits, criminal accountability, congressional responsibility, and whether democratic institutions proved resilient enough under pressure. Since these investigations began, courts, Congress, and voters have continued wrestling with those same questions. The Supreme Court's later rulings on presidential immunity and executive authority only intensified debates about how, and whether, former presidents can be criminally prosecuted for actions connected to official duties. Those legal battles are still shaping American politics today. What this hearing ultimately revealed was not simply partisan anger. It revealed a growing fear on both sides that the rules governing presidential accountability may no longer be clearly settled. And once a democracy begins arguing over whether its leaders can truly be held accountable, every future election becomes about far more than policy alone. What do you think? Should criminal investigations involving presidents continue regardless of political consequences, or does aggressive prosecution risk turning the justice system into a permanent political weapon? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. And if you value long-form congressional analysis that goes beyond headlines and examines the legal, constitutional, and institutional battles shaping Washington, subscribe to Capitol Oversight for more deep oversight coverage and hearing breakdowns.